Hi everyone, thank you for coming to watch my talk today. So today I'm going to be talking about syntheticity and how it was a feature of the Coptic language stage within the history of the Egyptian language, and how this shows us a possible influence that ancient Greek may have had on the development of Egyptian. But let's start with syntheticity and what it actually means. So this involves a pattern called the linguistic cycle, which has been the main focus of my PhD research. But for anyone who's not familiar with this, the linguistic cycle describes the pattern of alternation between more analytic forms, which contain more elements which can usually be separated, and more synthetic forms, which contain less elements which are usually inseparable. And to give an example of each of these, we have the English form, I am going to stop, which is very analytic and contains 5 different elements, which could mostly all have something like an adverb inserted between them. And in contrast, we have the ancient Greek equivalent of I am going to stop, palso, which is quite synthetic with 3 elements, which are all quite short and which are completely inseparable. And you can even see just by looking at these next to each other that palso is a lot shorter than its English equivalent and a lot more synthetic. So one of the most obvious languages to contain examples of the linguistic cycle is Egyptian, with this pattern being visible in quite a significant number of Egyptian constructions, including every single one of its verbal constructions. And it's these verbal constructions that my research has been focused on. Each individual verbal construction shows the development from a synthetic form to a more analytic form to a more synthetic form again. And you can see here an example of this from the negative past construction, the forms of which show this development from synthetic to analytic and to synthetic again. There are also a few constructions which show further repetitions of bits of the cycle. So, for example, the negative future has an extra analytic stage, the negative habitual has an extra synthetic stage, and the past has both an extra analytic stage and extra synthetic stage. And in general, their developments fit with this statement by Paul Grimm, that as a language as a whole doesn't have synthetic and analytic stages, and instead the analytic and synthetic stages of each construction happened at different times. For example, the terminative construction can be classed as changing from synthetic to analytic from around the end of the 18th dynasty, so roughly around 1300 BCE, but then it becomes synthetic again around the 21st dynasty, so somewhere around 1000 BCE. But a different construction, the temporal construction, doesn't become analytic until sometime in Demotic, which was used frequently from around 400 BCE to 200 CE, and then only becomes synthetic again at the start of Coptic around the 3rd century CE. So we're looking at over 1,000-year time difference between either the analytic stages or synthetic stages of these two constructions. And consequently, within individual language stages, there are constructions which are in their own analytic stage and those which are in a synthetic stage. So, for example, within late Egyptian, which has sometimes been categorized as an analytic stage of the Egyptian language, over half the verbal constructions are actually in synthetic stages within their own individual developments. And this random creation of the linguistic cycle across different constructions, rather than them all being analytic at the same time, then synthetic at the same time, is generally the case across every verbal construction and across the whole history of the Egyptian language. However, when we get to Coptic, this isn't really the case any longer. At the beginning of Coptic, each verbal construction experienced an increase in syntheticity, and only the negative future construction actually became more analytic again within Coptic, with every other construction continuing to be in a synthetic stage throughout the Coptic language stage. So because of every individual verbal construction being synthetic and mostly all staying within a synthetic stage, we can actually class Coptic in general as a synthetic stage within the development of the Egyptian language, something we can't do for any other language stage. So although there could be a few different processes involved in the increase of syntheticity of Egyptian verbal constructions in the creation of their Coptic forms, the main process involved with coalescence, in which 2 independent words become one word. This happened pretty much identically in every construction. In the forms used with pronoun subjects, the auxiliary and subject were already inseparable due to the historical use of suffix pronouns. So coalescence here involved the coalescence of the content verb and any other markers in the construction to this auxiliary subject group. In forms which were used with noun subjects, the subject and auxiliary were not inseparable already. So coalescence involved the coalescence of the subject and auxiliary, along with any other markers. But in these forms, the content verb remains separable from the rest of the construction. And as I said, this occurs in every single verbal construction, even those which had already previously shown increases in syntheticity, either through coalescence or by another process. So the widespread nature of this coalescence, which caused an increase in syntheticity in every construction, would suggest that the creation of the Coptic written language, which was the time at which this all happened, provided the opportunity for the standardization of verbal constructions in this regard. But given that different constructions within languages and within all earlier stages of Egyptian typically change at completely different rates, how is the creation of Coptic able to provide an opportunity for widespread change like this? Well, this was possible due to a gap at the end of the use of the Demotic as a written language and the development of Coptic as a written language. This occurred during the Roman period, in which Demotic was used less and less for texts like official contracts and became more and more restricted to use inside temples. This left the Egyptian-speaking population in what Forney has called a situation of collective agraphia, in which they had no writing system which matched the Egyptian spoken language, but had to use Greek for writing instead. This use of Greek as a principal written language between the decline of Demotic and the creation of Coptic ensured that when Coptic was created, it was done so by the conscious and deliberate invention of Egyptian speakers, allowing for standardizations to be made, such as the widespread coalescence in verbal constructions. It's also highly likely that constructions continue to develop within the spoken language during this period of agraphia, so that when the Egyptian language did regain a written form within the creation of Coptic, it was essentially playing catch up with any developments which had happened in the spoken language, while there was no corresponding written language. The deliberate change of language is something which has been viewed as largely improbable by scholars, such as Chomsky and Hall, who allege that an adult possesses an inability to modify his grammar except by the addition or elimination of a few rules. Or by Anderson, who has said that surely no individual has the power to change a language, deliberately or otherwise, nor are languages known to change as a result of speakers' collective deliberate decision. Several occurrences in which deliberate changes to a language by speakers have occurred have been noted by Thomason. However, even she states that the extreme results of this, like what we see in the widespread coalescence and increase in syntheticity in Coptic, are very rare. Deliberate change to a language by its speakers is rare enough to be considered impossible by some linguists, like those in the last slide, since deliberate change is normally restricted by the continuous use of the language, as is the widespread change of all constructions at once. A language which is currently in use by millions of speakers across a wide area cannot change all at once, since it will take time for each various group of speakers to pick up and start using new innovations in the language. For example, in an investigation of the developments from Latin to French, Paul Grimm has observed that the typological changes which happened in the development of this language were at no moment integral and did not affect the entire structure of the language all in one go. However, the collective agraphia of the Egyptian population ensured that when Coptic was invented in the 3rd century CE, it could be done so deliberately, since the written language had not been in continuous use, and it consequently provided the opportunity for those involved in the creation of Coptic to make deliberate and synchronous widespread changes to the written language, including the widespread and standardized coalescence evident in verbal constructions, which, alongside the process of erosion in some constructions, then subsequently caused widespread increases in syntheticity, causing the Coptic stage of the Egyptian language to be able to be classed as a synthetic one. So, while the aim of those who created the Coptic written language was to provide a means of writing which corresponded to the Egyptian spoken language, it is evidence that they were influenced not only by Egyptian, but by the Greek language, which had become the dominant written language in administrative contexts and in literary texts, as well as being the spoken and written language used by the ruling elite at this time. Because of this widespread use of Greek in such contexts, it's extremely likely that the people who were involved in first creating the Coptic writing system would have been bilingual. They obviously would have spoken Egyptian, probably being native speakers, or they wouldn't have been attempting to create an Egyptian written language. And these would have been people who were literate and who were used to writing documents, again, or they probably wouldn't have been interested in creating a whole new written language. So since the dominant written language at this time was Greek, they would have been accustomed to writing documents in Greek and thus would have been bilingual. There are also obvious signs of familiarity with the Greek language by the creators of Coptic within the Coptic written language itself. The most obvious of these is the use of the Greek script in the writing of Coptic, which you can see in this image at the side of the screen, which is a sheet from a Coptic codex from the British Museum. And in this text, as in all Coptic texts, you can see that most of the letters are from the Greek alphabet, with just a few extra ones derived from demotic signs to represent a few missing sounds. Coptic texts also show the borrowing of thousands of Greek loanwords from all word classes, so nouns, verb, particles, etc. And the proportion of Greek loanwords in Coptic texts reached around 40%. The adoption of Greek grammatical features into Coptic is less obvious, with Greek loanwords frequently taking on the grammatical features of Coptic, rather than retaining the grammatical features they exhibited in Greek. Although there is evidence of some Greek grammatical features being used in Coptic texts, such as in the Calysostracon from the 3rd century CE, in which the Greek name Imuthes is spelt with its Greek grammatical form. We can also see in this example on the screen what Loprieno has referred to as the desire to imitate a Greek syntactic model, which is seen in the Boharic example here. In the Greek version of this clause, the verb, which is in an aorist passive imperative form, has a third person singular ending, which then agrees with the third person singular noun onoma, which is a subject. In the version written in the Boharic dialect of Coptic, the verb, which is in a causative imperative form, also takes a third person singular subject, using a pronoun. And since Coptic can distinguish between masculine and feminine here, this is masculine, and this agrees with the third person masculine singular noun ran. But we can see from the version in the Sahidic dialect of Coptic that Coptic doesn't have to do this like Greek does, and Coptic can actually just insert the noun as the direct subject of the verb, while Greek has to have this matching verb ending. So in the Boharic example, we can see that a pronoun has been inserted as the direct subject of the verb, and the noun moved outside the structure of the verbal construction, doing something that is not actually required in Coptic, but which imitates the syntax of the Greek example as best as Coptic can. So now we've seen that it was possible for Coptic to take on Greek grammatical features. So from this, we could say that it's possible that the overarching grammatical properties of the Greek language may have had some impact on the formation of Coptic. Since the widespread use of Greek as a dominant written language had exposed Egyptians to a larger amount of Greek writing, and those creating Coptic were bilingual Egyptian and Greek speakers, or were at least able to read and write in Greek, the linguistic features of Greek would have been familiar to literate Egyptians. These features also would have been consistently visible during the writing of Coptic texts, since a lot of Coptic literature is made up of translations of Greek texts. So the people writing such Coptic texts would have most likely had a copy of the original Greek text in front of them. At the time at which Coptic was created and developed into its standardized form, the Greek language was highly synthetic, with its verbal constructions using agglutinating forms, in which words were formed by the addition of affixes to the verbal root. And you can see a couple of examples here where you can see all the different affixes of a couple of constructions on the verbal root pal. And this is similar to Coptic, which can also be described as having agglutinating verbal constructions, each of which is highly synthetic. And again, there's a couple of examples on screen for you to show you all the affixes here, in each of which sotum is the verbal root. So it's possible that the synthetic and agglutinating nature of Greek verbal constructions at the time at which the Coptic writing system was created may have influenced the nature of Coptic, causing forms which had been viewed as independent words in earlier periods to become inseparable affixes within Coptic forms. And the idea that the Greek language had any kind of influence like this in the features of the Coptic written language is of course supported by some Egyptologists and rejected by others. So a supporter of this is Renkus, who has said that from the perspective of relating non-Egyptian features of Coptic grammar to linguistic change through intensive language contact, Coptic Egyptian is a linguistic outcome of widespread bilingualism within a speech community, with Greek as a politically and culturally predominant language. And in other words, Coptic can be classified as a bilingual language variety with two parent languages, Egyptian and Greek. So his view is that Greek had a reasonably significant influence over the developments of the grammatical features of Coptic. And he also later talks about the ability of Coptic to restructure sentences according to a Greek model, as we've already seen an example of. So from this point of view, Greek was able to influence the grammatical features of Coptic, not just the script and lexical characteristics. And thus, taking this viewpoint, it was possible for Greek to have influenced the syntheticity of Coptic. However, if we look at Gracemans' investigation into whether Greek influenced the Coptic preference for prefixing, we're presented with a completely opposite conclusion, that it's unlikely that Greek-Egyptian contact played a significant overall role in the development of Egyptian morphosyntax, at least in the domain of affixing. However, while it's unlikely that Greek would have affected the preference of Coptic to use prefixes, as Gracemans suggests, being a language which predominantly used suffixes itself, Gracemans' findings do not actually exclude the possibility of Greek having influenced the coalescence and subsequent use of affixes at all in the development of Coptic, particularly within verbal constructions. So if we take a look at the data from Gracemans' study, we can see that while Greek has an overall lower affixing index, within the two categories of pronominal subject and tense aspect affixes on verbs, which are number 2 and 3 in the table, the elements which were involved in, these were the elements which were involved in the widespread coalescence and subsequent increase in syntheticity in the development of Coptic verbal constructions. And in these, Greek has an equal affixing index to Coptic. Also, these two affix types, along with case affixes on nouns, are considered to be especially important within the methodology used in this study, and so would have had more of an impact through language contact than the later affix types in the table, in which Greek does not use affixes. Furthermore, the methodology itself actually has an issue, in that it doesn't take into account the agglutinating and highly synthetic nature of Greek verbal constructions, in which there aren't just affixes on verbs, but there's a high quantity of affixes on verbs. For example, the examples of the pluperfect and future passive that I showed a few slides back each contain 3 or 4 affixes rather than just 1. But the high quantity of affixes isn't differentiated from the possibility of there being just one affix in the methodology in the study. So since agglutination and a high quantity of affixes is a characteristic also evident in Coptic verbal constructions, it still may be possible that this came from the influence of Greek. So to conclude, it's clear that unlike any other stage of the Egyptian language, Coptic may be classed as a synthetic stage. This was able to happen due to the period of Agraphia, in which there was no written language available for the Egyptian-speaking population, and if they wanted to write something, they had to use Greek instead. So when the written language of Coptic was created, there was able to be deliberate and widespread change across all constructions all at once, rather than change happening at different times in different constructions as it had in earlier periods. Also, since the people who were creating the Coptic written language would have been bilingual, knowing both Egyptian and Greek, it's quite possible that the contemporary Greek language had some impact on the creation of Coptic beyond the obvious influence on the alphabet used and the loanwords borrowed. So although Gracemans' study showed that Greek had a lower affixing index than Coptic, when considering multiple aspects of the language, since the classification of entire languages into types is difficult in most cases, if not impossible, it is possible that Greek did influence the increase in syntheticity in Coptic verbal constructions, as when the features affecting verbal constructions are considered, the affixing index for Greek is the same as that for Coptic, and both languages may be classed as agglutinating. So it is perfectly possible that their familiarity with the Greek language may have subconsciously influenced the creators of the Coptic written language into developing their language into a synthetic stage. And in any case, that the contemporary Greek language was able to influence the grammatical features of Coptic in this way should certainly not be ruled out. Thank you for watching.